So let me get started. Welcome, Kai. So let me start by asking you a little bit about your background in Stoicism. When did you discover Stoicism? What do you like about it? A little bit about yourself, please.
So I am Kai. I am currently working for UC Louvain, or the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium. But I've been a bit displaced. I'm still stuck in Portugal as I'm unable to move because of the COVID situation. My background is actually, my PhD is sustainable energy. So I'm actually an engineer by training, which is really unusual when you say, and I also do philosophy. That's a very unusual combination. And I have this combination because I believe that engineers are really good at asking like how to build a bridge and what with, but we don't really ask in our classes or even in our, the private sector, why should we build a bridge? Like no one ever thinks about efficiency of not building a bridge, because I always tell my students the most efficient bridge you can have is one you don't build. So I just felt that I needed to go into philosophy because I just didn't get the why answer. So it's not a criticism to engineering, because I don't think that engineers necessarily have to always ask why, but I think there is space for like a bridge between the humanities, social sciences, and engineering mathematics. So my interest in philosophy was just answering the question why, and I personally believe, and this is just my personal opinion, that Stoicism of all the philosophies provides me with the best why, because it says I can tell you something about the good life. And if you don't agree that the good life means being just, courageous, self-controlled, and wise, then I would say that Stoicism has nothing for you. So Stoicism is not something that is for everybody. It's not designed for everybody, because some people really do not believe that eudaimonia, or the flourishing life, is only up to them. Which is interesting when you look at, say, even a political or religious perspective, because if we say take Marxism, Marxism talks about the framing of oppression. And Stoicism says the only way you can be oppressed is to oppress yourself. Because the minute you believe that you're oppressed, you're no longer in control of your own journey towards eudaimonia. So that's quite a strong statement. So I find that very interesting. I think the Stoic God, for example, provides some answers that if I take an agnostic atheistic approach, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, because, and this is to quote A.A. Long or Anthony Long, the Stoic theology is the foundation of the ethics. In fact, he says, and this is his word, not mine, that the ethics are parasitical upon the theology, which to me is far too strong a statement. But I haven't done the research that Professor Long has done, so I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. So when we try to uproot Stoicism and just operate in terms of the ethics, if you dig deep enough, and you only have to dig about an inch from the soil, I would say, you realize that the hard rock foundation is this theological framework. So this is something that I would like to talk to you about, that I'm not saying you should believe or you should not believe in Stoic God. That's really not my interest. But what I'm saying is that if you believe that you want to live an ethical life according to the Stoic framework, then you must, according to Anthony Long, Professor Christopher Gill, John Sellis to a very strong extent, myself and others, say at least I must take this into consideration, because without doing so, the ethics are very superficial. Now, that doesn't mean that I would want you to really embrace the theology, because you know what? You might be into Stoicism just because you like some parts of the toolkit. So I'm not questioning whether you should or should not like the toolkit. I'm just saying, if you want to live the Stoic life, you want to walk with Stoicism, you really do have to embark on the Stoic theological framework. And you can, again, accept or reject as much as you want. That's, again, it's not for me to tell you how to live your life, right? In fact, if I were to tell you to live your life in a certain way and you did so, that wouldn't be Stoicism at all, because then your eudaimonia would be dependent on what I think and feel, which is incorrect. So that's kind of the background I have.
So Kai, let me ask you, what is the Stoic conception of God?
Well, so Zeno says we should live according to nature. Now, I think that has two parts. That's our own nature, as in my nature as a human being, and specifically as a social being and as Kai. And I also have living according to nature as in understanding how the world works and living accordingly. Now, I have to draw a little caveat here, because that does not mean, as Lawrence Becker suggests, I do not believe it means live according to fact. I think it goes beyond that. And why do I think that it goes beyond living according to facts? Because facts don't tell you what to do. For example, it is a fact that we have some kind of climate breakdown at the moment, and that we have a temperature on the Earth that is not the highest it's ever been. Certainly not true. So if anybody tells you that global warming is terrible because it's the highest temperature we've ever had, that's not true. However, it's really high when you consider there are 7 billion people on the planet, and the majority of which live on the coast. Then it becomes an ethical question. So the fact is the temperature is relatively high for the amount of people on the planet. But that doesn't tell me if I should care about those people. It doesn't tell me anything. So if I live according to fact, that doesn't mean anything for me, because David Hume would say, I can't derive values from fact. And I would agree with him if I use an atheistic or agnostic interpretation. So that's what I mean by living according to nature. The Stoic God is the essence of nature, if you will. So there's two parts to the Stoic God. We see it like as an animal, right, in Stoicism. The body being the physical, like the thing that we would consider to be physical, although everything in Stoicism is physical. There is no soul that is not physical. The soul itself is physical. So the mind of God, the physical mind of God for Stoics, is the essence of nature, the logos, the rationality. And the body of God, which is equally physical, is what we would now call the physical world, as it were, the bit that we can see. But for Stoics, there's really no difference. The fragment of soul that I have in me and you each have in you is a physical fragment. It is not something that's immaterial. There is no immaterial as such in Stoicism.
Can you go ahead and make the distinction again about the physical and non-physical? I didn't get it.
Yeah, so of course. So the idea that there's an immaterial soul is something much more to do with Plato. And I believe personally that Christianity, Islam, Judaism comes from the idea that there is an immaterial soul. In Stoicism, we do not agree, in terms of the philosophy, that the soul is actually immaterial. The soul is physical. So
okay, let me interrupt, because let's try to, because if we can get this concept, clearly established, then we'll be able to build a great discussion on it. So let's look at history of how it comes. So because Stoicism comes fairly later in, after Greek and Roman times. So what were the concepts of God before that time? And how is, like, for example, what was the common notion of God held by Greeks? And how is the Stoic God different? Or what is, Aristotle's conception? What is Plato's conception? Where do Stoics take it from there?
So the Stoics really have because, for example, Plato talks about forms, and the separation of the body and the spirit, so to speak, from Platonic perspective, is that the body is somewhat dirty or impure, and the immaterial is pure, which is something that Christians particularly are attached to. Stoics don't agree with that. They don't see as if there's an impurity as in the material is impure or dirty in some way, or incomplete in some way. It's a shadow rather than the essence of some kind of truth. So the Stoics say, no, there is no immaterial. There is just the material. Everything you see and you don't see, the fact that you don't see it doesn't mean it's not material. It just means you don't see it. So you've got the essence of God, the mind of God, because the Stoic God is seen in metaphorically as an animal, and the body of God, which is the bit we think is physical because it's the bit we see. But in their case, it's both. So the soul inside me is equally physical as my fingers are, because they say that my body and my soul are attached. So if it's immaterial, how could the soul be attached to me? That's the kind of question they ask. So they'll say it has to be physically attached because the soul is part of me and therefore is physical. It's not something that is immaterial. So that's a very big distinction that you come across when you look at, say, Christianity versus Stoicism, because we have an immaterial soul, and God is somewhat outside of the universe, as well as encompassed in the essence of the universe. For Stoicism, there is no outside. So even if there were, say, a heaven and hell, let's just say, which there isn't in the extent we would accept it as that situation, they would still say it's a physical part of the universe. It's not something that is indistinct from the universe. Nothing is indistinct from the universe.
So is Stoic God same as the concept of nature, which includes nature, external nature, as well as your nature?
So yes, depends how far you go down that line, and this is part of the complication because people who believe in the Abrahamic God want the Stoic God to be a certain way, and the people who are very pantheistic but not necessarily Stoic pantheistic want you to believe in a certain idea of nature. And then you have the Buddhist idea of God, which is again different, and I'm not an expert in that, so I won't go into it. So we're kind of on the fence. We get punched in the face like from all sides because we don't quite fit into how they want.
No, but let's avoid all this punching.
Okay.
The simplest way to avoid the punching is to go back in time, where all these people who are punching at you were not even there. So when you look at kind of the original works of Stoicism, what is the concept? Like when you read Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus in their original, and just try to see what are they saying when they talk about God.
Well, Epictetus is saying something different. This is part of the challenge, right? There's the argument there's 7 billion gods on the planet, right? So Epictetus' God is very much more theistic, very much more of a personal relationship than say Chrysippus' God. When Chrysippus offers proofs for God, he says things like this: arrogance is vicious. Therefore, to think that I am the be all and end all and the most important thing on the planet is vicious. Therefore, there is a God. So Chrysippus has a set of proofs, but they're very much more like philosophical sets of proofs. Cleanthes, on the other hand, has a hymn to Zeus, which is almost like a personified God. And I would say Epictetus too. So to say, what does Epictetus believe compared to Chrysippus, compared to say Posidonius, who again is much more what we would call atheistic or agnostic in his interpretation of God. He was, for example, the polymath who goes around the world, literally around his part of the world, looking into the mind of God. He believes the more knowledge he can obtain, the more he can see into the mind of God. And he sees like natural philosophy and science as one and the same, because the goal for him in terms of science and philosophy is to understand the mind of God and therefore understand the world and how it works. Because by understanding God, you can draw closer to God. If you understand how the world is in nature, you become more virtuous. Because the sage, so the ideal Stoic, is basically at one with the universe, right?
Okay. Wow. Mm-hmm.
So I can't tell you that because Epictetus said this and Marcus said this, because they all actually say different things. Like there is the idea that we all live according to nature, and that we should the objective yardstick we should use to understand what it is to be virtuous should be God. But their conception of God is slightly different, also because we've lost a lot of the texts. So where they have actually had texts that talk at length on God, those texts are missing. So it's also very hard for me to tell you, okay, across the board there was this agreement, because I imagine the agreement has disappeared along the sands of time.
Okay, that's a very good answer. But let's see if we can make it. I mean, what another way of looking at it is that instead of saying this person said this and another person said this, we can look at kind of a one view. So, for example, let's take the view that God is same as nature. Who would subscribe to it? So, for example, will Marcus Aurelius subscribe to that? Will Spinoza subscribe to that? Will the founding fathers subscribe to that? And is that one conception of Stoic God?
So Spinoza's God, again, is different. As is the founding fathers' God is more like Spinoza's God, because Spinoza's God is indifferent. So Spinoza's God is basically, the dice has been rolled, the motions have been set, and that God will just continue to run the universe, but will have no kind of interaction with you whatsoever. The Stoic God is providential and would like to benefit you, in the sense that the more you draw closer to the Stoic God, the more benefit you achieve, because you are aligning yourself with reality. You're aligning yourself literally with virtue. So that Stoics see that everything that happens to them as they align themselves with God, what we would say was good or bad, which is not. We say, oh, I lost my job, that's bad. Right? Stoics would say that's not really bad because it's not vicious. And actually what the Stoic God is giving you is an opportunity through that loss to really understand what virtue is, regardless if you have money or not. Right? Virtue, no one is immune from vice. So even if you're the wealthiest guy in the world or the poorest, neither of them are immune. And virtue is open to everyone. So it doesn't matter how poor you are or how rich you are, or how disabled or able you are. Your virtue is the thing that matters. So Spinoza's God is literally indifferent. It will continue you roll the dice and will continue to run. It's like the experiment you set, and then it will go through a period of time, and then things will, do have a cause and effect. Stoic God is providential. The Stoic God is that basically holds that all humans are inherently good, which is opposite to the Christian God, because you start with original sin. There is no original sin in Stoicism. Basically, we by misaligning ourselves and our desires with the Stoic God, then do what they would call vicious things. But we are inherently good, which is a fundamental difference from, say, Christianity.
Got it. So now let's move to the, talking more about the distinction between the Stoic God and the Christian God. So what are the various ways in which Stoic God and Christian God differ?
So yeah, first of all, you've got the idea that the Christian God exists outside of the universe, that he is somewhat distinct from that universe. Stoics would say no, that God is in the universe. That's why the animal, the body, and the essence of the rationality is God's mind, but that isn't separate from the universe. It's the connection of all the universe. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the Stoic God doesn't require that you believe in, say, a sacrifice. For example, Christianity the requirement is that you believe that God is the only God, and that you are originally, unfortunately, Adam and Eve sinned, and therefore to get back to God, you must accept a sacrifice. Okay, that's a very Christian perspective, because neither the Jews nor Muslims actually have this original, or particularly Islam has no original sin. In Islam, they eat from the tree and then they ask for forgiveness, and God says, okay. Right? So the original sin is very much a Christian perspective. So it's not that you suddenly become, in, say, Jewish circles, cleaner once you accept God, or in Christian circles that you're accepted through grace. It's that you are responsible for everything that you do, that the Stoic God gives you, like the Christian God will give you opportunities to work on your character. So there is, equally, it makes sense there. So but we don't see it in terms of sin. So it's not I'm sinful or I'm not sinful. It's literally I'm working towards virtue, or I'm falling back into vice. And in the end, for example, in Christianity, if you believe that Jesus Christ is your Savior and your Lord, and you do the things that are required of you, you will go to heaven, or alternatively, you will not go to heaven. In Stoicism, there is no heaven and hell as such. So the universe ends, and there is like a fire, and the universe starts again. And the thickest soul is the one of the sage, and it's the last to burn through. So the idea is that as you become more virtuous, your soul thickens. The tension that exists between like you and the universe and all the other nodes, it thickens and concentrates. And at the end, when the fire comes through, your soul is the last one to burn through. So I actually think it's quite nice. I actually like to imagine sometimes that when I'm seeking virtue, that my soul is actually thickened. It's not a fearful sense of there's no punishment from God. Like, well, to be fair, it's not particularly Christian view either. It's an addition to Christianity of if I have money or if things are going well for me, God loves me. And if I'm poor and things are not going well, God doesn't like me. And that is not actually Christianity. That's an 1850s adaptation into Christianity that was never originally there, and it's certainly not in Islam or Judaism. So again, like, it depends on what kind of Christianity one would recognize. For example, the Prosperity Bible isn't part of the Catholic doctrine at all. So again, I know that I'm always skating around the question, but it's because it's quite a complicated, nuanced question.
No, I think that's perfectly how this conversation goes, because we're talking about multiple views and kind of teasing out the differences between them. So I'm going to ask just one last question, and then I'm going to throw it up for questions here. There are many people lining up for questions. So my last question is, what is the relationship between the scientific worldview that we've had since the advent of modern science, Galileo, Newton, Darwin, their entire worldview, and the Stoic concept of God?
I mean, if you fail to look at the evidence, the science, you fail to understand God, right? Because the Stoic God is the essence of rationality. So if I'm turning around and say, I disagree with, say, Darwin, and I cannot provide you reasonable evidence to suggest why I disagree with Darwin, I don't really understand the nature of the Stoic God, because I'm not willing to say, well, this is the evidence. It seems the most reasonable. Because with Stoicism in general, it's not that every Stoic should do something other than be virtuous, right? It's not that what is virtuous, the way that virtue manifests in my life as a teacher is the same as the way virtue manifests when you're a car mechanic, right? So the way that you're just specifically is different if you're a car mechanic because you have a different role than I do, right? So if I cannot, so basically whenever I make a decision about what is just, I have to be able to defend it. I think I said to you by email that there's no such thing as universal bill of rights in Stoicism, because it depends. It always depends on who you are, where you're from, what was your circumstances, what were your choices, what choice did you have? Because the universal bill of rights says it doesn't matter what choices you had, this is wrong or this is right, or you have access to this under these conditions. And when Stoics will say, well, it depends, right? It always will depend. So in terms of the science, if I reject Darwin, there's not an issue there. That's not contradictory to Stoicism at all. However, if I fail to give you a good enough reason as to why I reject Darwin, that's not good.
Okay, that's fascinating. So then let me ask one more follow-up at the epistemological level, the issue of faith versus reason. So there are religions who regard faith as integral part of being religious. Yes. And what is the Stoic take on that, of faith versus reason?
Oh, I think, again, I don't believe that the Catholic faith nor Islamic, I know a lot about the Islamic faith. It's not, they don't ask you to believe without reason. Like if you look at the Catholic tradition and the Islamic tradition, but in traditions, it is very much tied into you must reason your faith. So if you ask for blind faith, that doesn't come from the Catholic tradition, doesn't come from the Islamic tradition. Now, again, that is a development subsequent to modern conceptions of particularly evangelical or Protestant Christianity. Why? Because they didn't rely on the Pope anymore, right? I mean, that's like a cop-out again, but there was a reason why you had to have faith, because you could no longer accept the Pope as the person who had sort of the almost divine authority as such. So, sorry, can you go back to your question so that I answer it properly?
Yeah, no, I think that was good. I mean, you're basically saying that faith is not part of the Stoic. You know, a Stoic would say faith itself is not good enough. You need to have reason.
I mean, you should have faith with reason, and that faith should be based on reason, right?
Based on reason, yes.
I'm not able to prove to you that there is a Stoic God, but I have reasons as to why I believe the Stoic God makes sense. So there is an element of faith to say that my understanding of the Stoic God is the understanding of the Stoic God, because I take it in. That is a faith statement. There's nothing in, because if it depends on you look at science. If you see science as something you objectively, or in terms of positivism, you have to prove from a quantitative point of view. This is the issue I have with science, is that actually science is both qualitative and quantitative, right? But we emphasize today science which is quantitative, that talks about how I can measure something. So if you're saying to me that science is about measuring the Stoic God, then my statement is a faith statement. If you say science also has something to say about qualitative statements and in the reasoning, logic, and grammar and rhetoric isn't just having an argument in a political fashion. It's the art of persuasion based on reason. This is why when you read Aristotle's rhetoric and other things like that, you actually realize that the way we use the term is a very superficial understanding of what in the 1850s US high school children were learning. They really were learning something much more deep about what rhetoric was. And the problem is, because we've lost the art of rhetoric, we actually don't discuss, particularly in the US, between each other. So the Democrats and Republicans don't chat because we think rhetoric means just use lying for our own purposes. But that's not what rhetoric was at all. So yes, it's a faith-based statement based on reason. So I can have faith, and I am called to have faith because there's no other way of saying it. But to have an unreasonable faith, or one that I can't defend, that's not Stoicism.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so now let's go to questions from the audience. Folks, we have 4 rules that we've used for the past 4 years in several, hundreds of meetups, which work very well. Number 1, when you have a question, raise your hand. And you can raise your hand in 3 different ways. You can type a question. or you can type exclamation mark into chat, or you can raise the hand in Zoom. Number two, keep on topic. We're talking about the concept of Stoic God and its relationship to other conceptions of God. Number three, be brief. There's a lot of people who have a lot of things to say. We want to get to all of that. And number four, be courteous. Feel free to be candid. Feel free to disagree with anything anybody says, but do so courteously. Okay, so it's going to be Chase, then Joe, then Joel, then Alex, then Lee, and then James. I'm going to have to unmute you when you can speak, but Chase, go ahead.
Awesome. I'm actually going to change my question just a little bit. My question is, how does adopting the idea of the Stoic God change the way that you either operate in the world in terms of the practice of Stoicism, or view the world in terms of, like, what are the practical implications on your own, moving throughout the world?
I'm just going to write your question down so I make sure I always come back to your key question, practical implications. Okay, I can answer this in terms of Becker. So if you haven't read A New Stoicism, Becker says that living according to nature is living according to fact. The problem is that means, as I just said, that there are some things I cannot decide living according to fact. I cannot decide whether I should shoot someone or not based on a fact. The fact is they will die possibly if I shoot them. That doesn't tell me if I should or not, right? So living according to fact can be very dangerous, because you say, well, that doesn't tell me if I should shoot someone or not, or under what circumstances I should do that, or under what circumstances I should, in Stoicism, for example, kill myself. That's a very common issue. So I'm saying very strong statements, but Stoicism does have like an issue with like euthanasia that people just don't really talk about, like Cato and Seneca and Zeno. So you've got three big ones there. In terms of practical implications, if I just believe that it's according to fact, then I'm still using a yardstick that applies to me. The Stoic God yardstick, I start to ask myself the question, what would the sage do? What would the sage do? What is God calling me to do in terms of justice? So I always have to be just, right? I can't be unjust. But I can't just use my criteria. So if I can't only use my criteria about what I think is just, how do I determine what's just? Socratic reasoning. I have to have a discussion with you about what I think justice is in that specific situation, and then you would talk to me, and then you and I would come to agreement or not, and then we might involve somebody else, and basically, as long as everybody that we're speaking to is equally interested in justice, then that sense of the reason will come through, and that's what I follow. That's why Stoicism is up for debate. We have to have these debates, because without it, we can't necessarily see the reason. So my short answer is, it's actually made me think about more of the objective yardstick that the Stoic God provides, because if I just do it from an agnostic atheistic interpretation, it is not an objective yardstick at all. And it doesn't call me to use necessarily Socratic reasoning when it just involves myself, right? So if it just involves what I should do to be just, I don't necessarily, from an agnostic perspective, have to talk to anyone about that. But Stoicism calls you to say, okay, well, how would you determine the reason? Now, sometimes it's very obvious, but it's not always very obvious. So that's what the Stoic God calls you to do. You can't rely just on your own moral compass until you've had training. So even Seneca says this, and we misquote Seneca all the time, because Seneca says, they are your teachers, they are your guide, they're teachers, not your guides, basically. And therefore you can, when you're ready, you can take shortcuts or change the direction of whatever went before you. But he says, if you read him really carefully, you can only do that once you've been trained. So you can't just go into Stoicism and say, oh, well, Seneca says I can do whatever I like, because then I can say, okay, there's 5 virtues then, and there's nothing you can say. But Seneca actually said, which we misquote him, once you're trained in the rhetoric, logic, grammar, and all the other ethics and all the things that they taught us, and physics, then if you have a better route, then take it, but only then. And so if we have this really horrible disclaimer in Stoicism, I should frame it on my wall and say, I can do whatever I want because Seneca said. But if you read Seneca, that's not what he said. He said, okay, I can do this once I've gone through the thorough training of rhetoric, logic, grammar, physics, and so on and so forth. Then, and only then, when I have the background knowledge, I can stand on the shoulders of people that came before me. And I can see further only because I'm standing on the shoulders, to paraphrase Isaac Newton. Does that answer your question, Chase?
Our next question is from Terry. Terry, go ahead.
Right, yes. I'm wondering if what extra you get. I mean, it's easy for us, I think, to accept that there's a rational universe and that we have been given, each of us, a rational tool which we can use if we choose to in order to discover the nature of the universe. So, and that's easy for us. And also it's easy for us to accept that there's truth exists. Perhaps not in postmodernism, but for everybody else, truth exists and rationality exists. And we have these tools and the universe is rational. So what else is needed in order to do the work? I'm finding that I don't need anything else to do the work. So is there something else that's needed to, to be an ethical Stoic apart from that?
I think your issue is more like, why do I need to use the word God? Basically, you're saying I'm doing exactly the same as you are doing, Kai. Because I mean, it helps because I know you, right? But I'm basically doing the same thing you're doing. I'm just not calling you a God. And that's a fair comment. I think that's what you're really asking me. And my thing would be, one, the Stoics use the word God, and two, who say Christians have the monopoly on the word God? I mean, why should we give the monopoly on that word? I'm sorry. Like, as academics, we are able, as my mum would call it, big enough and ugly enough to define words well. I mean, if we're philosophers and we can't do that, what on earth are we doing? So I understand that my colleagues and I have had many debates about whether we should use the word God. And my point is, if it's good enough for Marcus Aurelius, if it's good enough for Epictetus, Chrysippus and Zeno, it was quite atheistic, if you like. I mean, the guy was an anarchist communist, but if you're going to put it, it's not fair. That's not fair to him. I'm sure him into a box he shouldn't be in, right? But that's what we would call him today. So if it's good enough for Zeno, Chrysippus, Cleanthes, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Musonius Rufus, and so on and so forth, and it's good enough for me. I just do not think that I am so above their understanding and their wisdom that I'm entitled not to use the word. So I prefer to be much more careful with my definitions. But I would say, Terry, you are following the Stoic God. I mean, I would actually say that from what I know of you, that is certainly your efforts. And I'm not saying I know everything about you, but I know that you're very sincere in your journey. So why should I not use the word if that's the word they use? Now, that doesn't mean that we have to be very careful, right? Because if you go back to how when we used to have debates and rhetoric, if you couldn't define your terms in Islam, for example, you couldn't define your terms in the traditional Islam, you lost the debate. So you had to clearly state what you meant by God. And if you couldn't do it, you lost before you even argued. So this is going back to a very sort of ancient way of learning and an ancient way of having discussion. And I think you and I, Terry, have discussed very, very gently about why we need to be very careful with the words we use. And I think you and I are very much in agreement with that. Does that answer your question, Terry?
Yeah, that's very reassuring. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you.
Let's so the next question is from Joe. What we do, Kai, is that we don't do too much follow-up.
Okay.
So because what we do is that because our aim is to get as many questions on the table, as many questions answered as possible. So next up is Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for presenting today. You'd spoken a lot about how God outside the cosmos and inside the cosmos. So is it the Stoics' belief that the cosmos or the universe is finite? And if so, how does it view things like, I don't want to get too far off topic, but an idea of like infinity, if possible, if you don't want to get to the second one.
Can you just repeat the last bit of your question? Sorry.
How does it look at the concept of infinity within that concept, if it if it believes it's finite?
Very good question. Well, currently physics is saying that the universe is expanding, right? But I guess, I mean, I'm not a physicist, so I don't have an issue saying if the Stoics believe that it's finite and somebody proves to me that it's infinite, then you know what, we need to update Stoicism. It's not going to, if we are so religious that we cling on to our equivalent of some religious text, and not naming a particular book, then we are not in Stoicism, because Stoicism doesn't call us to cling on so tightly to tradition. This is why Seneca says, once you've had the training, you are very welcome to divert from the path if you find it helpful. but only once you've had the training. So the issue that I have is that some Stoics, even contemporary, I call people contemporary rather than traditional versus modern, because that tells me what you believe in terms of God. But contemporary Stoics, even the ones that are publishing, I can tell you based on what they write that they haven't done the legwork that A.A. Long has done. They haven't done the legwork that Professor Gill has done. And I am trying very hard I've worked with them to come to these conclusions. That doesn't mean that there's nothing to be said or useful in the contemporary Stoics, and I won't know names, who don't think there's anything useful in the agnostic God. And that's great, because I would call, like, when you first come into Stoicism, and if particularly you lost your faith recently and you're really mad, you don't want to use the word God. And that's why Terry and I would agree, like, perhaps saying the word God isn't very helpful. But then we should be big enough and ugly enough to define it. So in your answer to your question, if they could prove to me theoretically that it was infinite, I don't have an issue. Like, I'm not going to cling on to any bit of Stoicism that's completely and utterly nonsense. I just don't think the Stoic God is nonsense because of the reasons I've said.
Next question is from Amjol. Amjol, go ahead.
I just have a quick question, a point of clarification. I think you said logos and as the essence, and that perhaps is essence of nature or universe or maybe God. And then you said it's something that's physical. And the point of clarification is, when you say physical, do you mean material? And could you elaborate a little bit more what that would mean? What's the definition of physical, material, or what that would mean? That's all.
So when I say physical, I mean material. From a Stoic perspective, right? So I'm not going to say to the general public, general public. But in this conversation, like, when I say physical, I really mean material. Like, they are materialists, right?
How could something that acts as an essence be material?
Well, like, how could a soul be material, right? Because I don't want to use the word brainwash because that's not a reasonable word, but we've been taught that the soul is immaterial. And how can the soul not be material? How can it be material? Because we've been taught so much. So the idea is, how can it be physical? Just because you can't, they would argue, because you couldn't see it doesn't mean it isn't there. And I guess you could even use quantum. I'm not a quantum mechanic guy, but you could use quantum mechanics and say there are things that you can't see, but it doesn't mean they're not there. So again, you could say, well, that's a faith statement. There's no evidence for that. Okay. I mean, I would accept your argument if I can't provide them right now. I can't give you a good enough reason other than to say, just because I use the word essence, but I guess it's the mind. Again, it's the mind of God. And my mind, I would say, is actually physical. The matrix of my mind is physical. If you take my brain out, my mind in an immaterial sense doesn't exist anymore, right? So that's the Stoics would say, your mind is physical. It's not the brain necessarily, but it is physical. So that's really hard. And you say, okay, well, that's attention. I don't accept that. I don't want to believe in the Stoic God because of that. Then I'd say, good luck to you. I'm not going to defend it to the high heavens. Or I will say is that just because we've been taught that an essence doesn't, for example, how do I say, like, you might have a food and you say there's an essence to this food, but that essence will be very much locked into a particular spice. So you might say this particular rice has like an essence, has an aromatic smell to it, but that aromatic smell will be as a result of a spice that has been placed in the rice.
Next question is from Alex. Alex, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Kai, for your talk. I guess my question is related to the previous one just now, but from a different angle. I'm wondering about the fact and value distinction and interaction. So you mentioned that the Stoics allow us to answer not just questions about fact, like how does something work, but also the why question. Why do we want to build a bridge, or why do what we do? And I'm wondering how the two relate in Stoicism. It seems to me like the value question would be connected with this essence or this intelligence that's in the world. And somehow that would be a purpose, not just a kind of, sometimes I guess they're called final causes, not just a kind of push-pull mechanical picture of the world, but there is a larger sort of purpose or goal. And I'm wondering how these two aspects relate, and if the Stoics say anything about their relationship.
In terms of purpose, I mean, Epictetus is very strong when he says that we are given divine roles. Like Cicero says our roles are more like a play, and he's very much, being Cicero, he's very much interested in the audience reaction. So he does things because it's decorum. He does things because, and when he writes on duties to his son, basically, he's basically telling his son how to act in a certain way to appease the audience, right? That doesn't mean that he's only interested in that. That is his framing. Epictetus says, no, our roles are divinely given. Like, for example, if you don't need to know much about the Stoic God in an academic sense, that's because your role doesn't require it. And if it does, you're acting in ignorance, because we're not called as Stoics to know everything, but we are called to know what we need to know to involve ourselves in our own personal role. In terms of cause and effect, we have to remember that the cause and effect from Courteous' point of view is like the cylinder. So he'll say that we behave in a certain way because we're cylindrical, but also because that cylinder is placed on a slope. So their cause and effect isn't quite the same. It isn't, as you said, certainly mechanical. So in terms of, so we have, let's say we have a fact. So a fact is I speak English, right? That's a fact. In fact, it's a fact for everybody here. But that doesn't tell you how I should speak English or why I should speak English. That's why I said, grammar will tell you how to write, but not whether you should write. This is Epictetus again. So just because I speak English doesn't mean that I should talk all the time. And I admit I'm talking a lot now. But if I was an audience member, it wouldn't be right for me to talk. And then they would say, why is it not right for you to talk? He said, it would be unfair. So let's say Terry was talking and he was giving me a speech or a lecture of some description. If I was interrupting him, that would be unreasonable, because my role as audience member means that it's not appropriate for me to talk out of turn. So that's why the Stoic values just come in. So you have this, and they'll say, so I have a fact, but that fact is rooted in my role, and that role then tells me my values, right? Or not tells me values, tells me how to operate according to the values. So it's very much more intricately connected than, say, David Hume would say. David Hume would say, yeah, but you cannot connect facts and values at all. And the Stoics who agree in the Stoic God, they said, you can, because your role, which is a fact, I'm a teacher, is divinely given. So they'll say, I mean, there's not enough material for them they haven't really developed that. And because they did develop a lot of material, but it's gone. So I feel like, okay, so I have facts to operate around with. For example, climate breakdown is a fact. Why do I think we should do something? Because it is fair. And why do I think that's fair? Because that's what Stoic God says, that I should walk towards justice, right? That's what they'll say. And you say, well, that's an axiomatic value. Yes, it is. And that's why I said Stoicism isn't for everybody. If you don't believe that eudaimonia is about justice, courage, self-control, and wisdom, then Stoicism has nothing for you, because it'll say that your facts and your values are derived from that. So if you think eudaimonia is something else, not you personally, but anybody, so you could say eudaimonia is also about being wealthy and about being educated, to use Aristotle, then I'll say Stoicism has nothing for you then, because you also say that if you're not educated, you can't achieve eudaimonia, and therefore the Stoics can't help you, because they actually say that's not true. So there are still axiomatic value statements, and then you have to, if you walk in Stoicism, you have to say whether you accept that or not. But if you do accept that, then you say, then your values are very much in line with the facts around you. And if you don't, well, then you probably shouldn't be a Stoic.
Next question is from Lee. Lee, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually posted my question before the speaker started happening, so this may be a bit redundant from Terry and Chase, but with Stoicism defining God as a one with the universe, and a lot of people in the world have a concept of God that is not that. Although the Stoics, of course, have a right to use the term, and you've earned your right to use it, isn't it more troublesome because of all the baggage that comes with the concept of God and the mere number of people that use that term? It seems counterintuitive that it's a good thing to do.
I mean, in terms of baggage, it's a really good question. I would say there's a lot of baggage that comes with, say, the way that we respond to, say, gender equality. There's a lot of baggage there, right? That doesn't mean I shouldn't do something about it, just because when I say, for example, when I say male or female, other people have different interpretations of what is a gender as opposed to a physical sex. There's a lot of baggage. There's a lot of baggage. I mean, right now in America, there's a lot of baggage around the race issue. Now, I don't want to talk about it because I don't think it's appropriate, but there's a lot of baggage about what it means to have equality. We Stoics have never been ones to shy away from baggage. In fact, Stoicism is not the Epicurean garden going, I don't want baggage. I need to sit in my garden, free from baggage, get my red wine, and feel pleasure, because I just need to be at peace with myself. So baggage is never a one from that should encourage a Stoic, right? So baggage is one of the things that we should be able to be like, okay, there is baggage, and why is there baggage? And then we might have a discussion about why is it reasonable that, say, Christians have a monopoly on when they say God what they mean. And then we can discuss about whether they should have monopoly on it. So baggage to me is like a red flag through a ball, in the sense that that should encourage Stoics to debate it and to unpick it and to deconstruct it, to use a sort of continental philosophy. So yes, there is baggage. There's baggage with a lot of things that matter. I mean, there are lives that matter, and there's a lot of baggage right now. That doesn't mean that I should be indifferent to it. That doesn't mean I should ignore it. In fact, ignoring it is as we are learning at the moment, has not helped the issue. So the same as the Stoic God. As long as I define my terms, and you and I having an intellectual and intelligent debate, I don't see why I should be upset about potentially offending you, right? Because Stoicism isn't about taking offense or not taking offense. It's about having a debate and reasoning with each other out of love, kindness, consideration, because of what we're asked to do in terms of wisdom and justice and self-control. So I understand what you're saying, but I think, why should I shy away from a word if it was good? Again, because it was good enough for them. I don't feel like I'm so fancy and so educated as to not need the word anymore. And I think something is lost when we just say, well, the only way to have a relationship with God is to, let's say, pray with a cross in your hand, or pray in a different way. There's also a relationship one can have with God. Now, you might be like, you might not like the word God, then don't use it. I'm not suggesting that you should use it. I'm just saying that there is no harm in using the word God as long as we are clear in what we mean. And also, I think it invites Christians to the table. I think that Christians who wholeheartedly follow God and wholeheartedly want justice, courage, self-control, wisdom, are much more comfortable when we include the word, because the opposite is, okay, we're not going to use the word, so anybody who has a faith, whatever that might mean, is not really welcome, because that's what we do when we restrict the use of a word. And I don't want to police words, right? I am very much in agreement of we should not police certain words, because we should just police the way that we use the words and the way that we use them, not the words themselves.
Kai, let me do a follow-up question based on Terry's question and Lee's question. You said that what Terry is doing is completely consistent, or what you would think is consistent with Stoic God. And Lee was asking, okay, why deal with the baggage? So let me put it another way. Let's say somebody is doing something which is consistent with Stoic God, without using the concept God, just using the concept of, this is nature and I'm living according to nature, using my reason. So my question is, on the positive side is, what does calling it God give you? Why do it? Because if you're using a concept, there has to be some kind of payoff. You are getting something from it. What do you get by adding the concept God to this conception?
So if you're, as I said, if you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist and have a very strong feeling about God, I think that is a much easier transition. But don't forget, the word nature also has baggage, right? So you can have a deep ecology perspective where you can believe that you can be a tree, that you can understand what it is to be a tree, right? That's deep ecology. They all say that humans have no inherent value compared to a tree, right? And Stoicism says we have no inherent value. No individual, Kai or Lee or Alex or Dan, none of us have intrinsic value, right? The reason has intrinsic value. So we are anthropocentric. When we say we live according to nature, if you go into the circles that I work in environmental science, they think you mean that you are biocentric, that you don't see that humans are necessarily inherently more valuable than any other species.
Maybe I put it too wide. So I would say, Kai, what do you get from using the concept God? Once you agree with Terry that, look, Terry is a reasonable guy, he's acting according to what I think God is. And what you're saying is that I still want to use the concept. What do you as a person get from using the concept God?
I mean, me personally, I think that it enhances my spiritual journey. So I think Stoicism is inherently spiritual. I wouldn't say it's inherently religious. So again, people seem to think that if I say I'm spiritual, that I have to have an inherently religious relationship to something. And I would say no. So for me personally, I feel much more comfortable working on that plane of having a spiritual journey, which I don't feel so comfortable when I just say living according to nature, because where I come from in environmental aspects, people then say, oh, so you're an eco-warrior and you think that anybody who eats meat is evil. Like I get actually a lot more baggage the other way around in my own life than if I just say God. If I start saying nature, that means so much to the groups of people that I spend a lot of time with. So again, like according to my role, if I didn't, maybe I'd be like less anxious, because I don't, for example, I've been attacked online for being an environmentalist, and we came to a conclusion that if you find my work, I never use the word environmentalist because it has a lot of baggage. So I think a lot of terms have a lot of baggage. So for me personally, it just enables me to continue my journey. And I think it actually endears me to a lot of religious people who tell me, based on their emails, they actually feel that they're accepted in Stoicism when other forms, when say modern Stoicism, if I mean like there's no God, they don't feel accepted. They don't feel that they belong. And they just feel that the Stoicism that I'm talking to them about, which I would say is Stoicism in general, but hey, I'm biased. Like they feel accepted. They feel that they can continue their journey with Jesus or the prophets or their Buddhist journey and still be a Stoic. But they've told me that when they've been told they can't use that word, it feels like they have to choose and they don't want to choose. And I'm like, who am I to make them choose? Like, so that's why I'm really sort of nervous about removing a word. But say Terry and I had a cup of tea again together, I wouldn't necessarily talk to God about Terry because it wouldn't necessarily help. So again, it's like it's not that I have to force it down someone's throat, but I think to have it open means that I think I'm better positioned to include a lot more people. And I think Stoicism is about being inclusive. And one of my major gripes with Stoicism, the way that it's being applied, it still feels very masculine and agnostic and atheistic to me. And I feel that a lot of, and people would have to correct me, I feel a lot of people of different ethnicities and different gender interpretations, they don't feel included because they feel that the objective issue of not having the God or having a certain way of Stoicism just automatically excludes their experience. So I'm with Terry, like I don't want to be like too postmodern about this, but I do want to be inclusive, and I want to be inclusive in a way that enhances dialogue rather than identity politics. So I don't want to play the identity politics game. So that helps me to do it as well.
Okay. I think Lee had a follow-up comment or question. Lee, go ahead.
Yeah, you just mentioned about not using the word environmentalist because of all the baggage it comes with it. And I would agree that in our conversations, in our dialogue, it would be fairest for the players involved or for the people involved to use the least amount of terms that need a bunch of definitions or that have a bunch of baggage that needs to be filtered through. Wouldn't it be best for anybody having a conversation to use the most simple terms that have the least amount of baggage or connotations? Isn't it fairest for the conversation itself, for the people involved?
It depends. And so the answer, you're always going to get a cop out from me because I'm always going to say it depends on who you're talking to. So the problem is when I quote Stoicism, it does say the word God. So I can't get away from that. It doesn't say the word environmentalism. So I can remove that from my vocabulary, but I can't talk. If I remove the word God, I actually take away a lot of the quote unquote Stoic canon, right? So even if I choose not to use it, if I want to have a meaningful conversation with people who are interested in the primary sources, I have to have it.
So would you agree that should Stoicism be adjusted? Although it probably can't. I understand that it can't be. But would you suggest that it would be better if Stoicism did not use it? In your personal view?
No, because I think it actually alienates people that have a faith. And I think Stoicism is about eudaimonia, and I think it provides eudaimonia in ways that certain interpretations and certain practices in religious contexts don't provide. So I would like to offer respite to people who would like to remain Christian and would feel very uncomfortable if I just remove the God. So I think it depends on who we're talking to. That's why I don't think that, it's not wrong to say perhaps we shouldn't use the word in every single case. Perhaps you're right. But to then remove it per se is then also to reject those people who say, well, I like God, I love God, I read the Bible every day, and I have John 3:16 on my T-shirt, and now you're telling me that I'm wrong and I can't be a Stoic. I just feel like my whole life, ended or something like that. And you'd say, well, if you want to use the word God, then great, just progress towards eudaimonia. And if you said to me, oh, I cannot stand the word God and it drives me crazy and I feel upset, then don't use it. I'm just saying I'm not going to remove it. As an academic, I cannot remove it because I'm using sources that use it. So again, if you're not an academic who's working with these primary texts quite a lot, then you don't necessarily need to use it. Not because I'm smarter than you or you're smarter than me. It's because my role requires that I use it. Perhaps your role, Lee, I don't know what your job is, but perhaps your role you don't need to. And perhaps in your circles, it really is the opposite of helpful. So if it's the opposite of helpful, Lee, then I encourage you not to use it. At the same time, I encourage you not to say to people, you can't use it, right? Because I don't want to police language. Again, we're not about policing language. It's just about using the appropriate word in the appropriate context to reach the people that want to be reached. That's why Zeno was very adamant about pacing up and down and making sure when he was at the Penny Porch, he was literally pacing up and down in a fast speed so that the people who were just going to heckle could be like, get out of my way. I'm only here if you really want to listen. And he said what he had to say. So in your circles, it might be that the God is the bogeyman and it's the worst word you could use. Then don't use it. It might be that in your circle it's very helpful. So then use it.
The next questions are from James, Gang, and Alex. James, go ahead.
Okay. All right. This is the first time I've really heard an extensive talk about God in relation to Stoicism, but it's interesting. So is that consistent with the Pascal's idea of a wager? Because when you mention God, to me, it just conjures up the idea of having faith or kind of a leap of faith. And Pascal's idea of a wager, because there's never a certainty about one's belief in God. So you have to, at some point, when things happen in life, you have faith in this God that requires more than just rationalization or reason to solve your problems, without God or.
Go ahead, Kai. Would you like to respond to that?
James, it's a really nice question. Pascal's wager is very interesting because he says basically you should just believe in God, because if you don't, you're going to be, you're going to lose anyway. Unfortunately for Pascal, though, he forgot that there was another opportunity to be like, what happens if this is the only life we have, Pascal, and I do what you asked me to do because I'm going to lose if I don't believe in God, and I live my life according to a lie. So Pascal doesn't really think that there's another option here. I could live my life in a way that was just and courageous and self-controlled and wise, that didn't require his specific God, because his specific God is about he would punish you, you'd go to hell or you go to heaven. And Stoic God, there is no real heaven and hell in the way that is interpreted in certain passages in the Bible, or at least Catholic traditions and Islamic traditions. So Pascal's wager doesn't give you all the options. Pascal is very naughty, I would say, in giving you only two options as if they're the only two options you have. Pascal, in my opinion, is completely and utterly wrong. If you've only got one life, then why would you live it according to, let's say, his particular God, which is a Christian flavor, if that's not the God that is the God at all? So for him, he doesn't see that option. He doesn't see that. Well, and I could argue with him and say, well, but what happens if Allah is the God and not Yahweh, right? He doesn't open, his mind is not open to that debate. So as there's no heaven, there's no fear of punishment in that sense. We punish in Stoicism, you punish yourself. Every time you live in vice, you're punishing yourself. because you're not aligning yourself with wisdom. You're not aligning yourself with the intelligence of the universe, of the logos of God. So that's enough punishment, really, from a Stoic perspective. And your soul does not thicken, in the sense that it's like a muscle. Your soul is, for Stoicism, like a muscle, in the sense that the more you work towards virtue, the stronger it gets. So the more balanced you are when life hits you, because you're more centered, right? Because your soul is thicker, and that's like at the center of the core of your being, but it is physical. So I understand the Pascal wager comment, and I know that people use that, but it's like, it's a very Christian argument, and Muslims would just say, well, why should I believe that Jesus Christ is God? Jesus Christ, Isa, is a prophet. So Pascal doesn't even give you that possibility. Stoicism says, if you believe that virtue is the only way to live a good life, then you are living and you are working towards that, and you have some essence of spiritual practice, whatever that means, and that can be what we might even call an atheistic interpretation of it. That is living virtue. That is living the good life. Pascal doesn't even talk about the good life. Pascal's not interested in the good life. Pascal's interested if you believe in a certain God or not. So it's a really good question, James, but it's not framed in a way that Stoic would really accept as a reasonable debate.
Next question is from Gang Tan. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question. So I always believe philosophy actually teaches us how to question. Religions tell us how to believe. So which I think there's an innate difference between them. And I grew up without religion. So I believe there's some kind of power, secret behind everything, but I don't really believe in God. And I actually get involved in Christian before. What I really don't like about it, and I like Stoicism, it's because Stoicism is about the internal virtue. Not because you do it for your next life or punish, go to the hell, which I really is use a fear tactic to manipulate people psychologically, which I really hate. Don't give you free will. So, and the thing is, kids, my son, none of them are religious, and they hate it, but they still need some kind of virtue and standard. That's why I see Stoicism, the hope. If they can believe in Stoicism, at least they have some kind of standard, moral standard to help them to grow, which we are lack in this society. I think I see the hope they help us.
I think that's a very good point, Jen. I honestly agree with you that religion should not be used to do that to people. I think it's the worst form of bullying there exists. I think spiritualized bullying of people is criminal. That's my personal opinion. I think it's disgraceful that we would do that, but not all religions actually call that. And if again, we have to distinguish between the contemporary and the traditional, because again, I know a lot about Islam. There is no, in the Quran it says there is no compulsion. You cannot force someone to believe something. And in the Catholic faith, again, the tradition is, again, when it doesn't get wrapped up in power. This is the problem. Religion gets wrapped up in power, and in fact, Stoicism gets wrapped up in power. And that's why we need to always question who is using Stoicism, what tool are they using. Silicon Valley uses Stoicism as a way of empowering the wealthy, right? So I agree with you that religion, if it is wrapped up in the guises of power and politics, and which is no issue to me, until we're not allowed to question it, and we use a spiritual bullying tactic to hit people over the head and remain poor and remain like, yes sir, I will do whatever you want because you're giving me this like eternal promise. I'm in complete agreement with you. Religion has no place, but religion doesn't actually, if you really read the text, doesn't actually say that. Like Jesus says, like, blessed are the meek, right? So the prosperity Bible and the idea that we can just somehow do whatever we've been told to do and not question it is a dangerous thing. And the Catholic faith, again, is very much into questioning. Like, you can say that the answers they came up with wasn't particularly useful, but Thomas Aquinas was writing proofs. And I'm not saying that Thomas Aquinas is correct. I'm just saying that he was writing proofs to show that God, he was questioning, and the priests of the Catholic, and not every single situation, and the kings did manipulate this, of course, but nobody's free. And Rome did the same with, I'm assuming, even with Stoicism. So religion per se is not the problem. I would say is not necessarily the problem. It's only if the way that we interpret it is spiritually bullying people. And then Stoicism says, regardless of what stick you use, Silicon Valley Stoicism, I coined the term with Leonidas Konstantakos in 2018, they are bullying women. And they're saying, well, you should be indifferent to your suffering. That is a form of bullying that Stoicism is being used to achieve. This is why you're absolutely right, again, to get your children, whatever they believe, whether they be Muslim, Christian, or believe in the I Ching, for example, to question really what's going on. Is this their religion? Is this the essence of truth? Or is this just somebody telling me an idea to do it so that I do what they want? So I'm against the idea that religion per se does that, but I know that it's a really, really good tool to use to manipulate. And it's very hard to stand up against it, which is, I think, why Stoicism is so important. But even with our own community, I've seen enough bullying to say that even Stoicism, if you don't check that what is actually being said, has been used to bully and beat down, in my opinion, women.
Oh, thank you very much, Kai.
You're welcome.
What we're going to do next is we're going to divide into small groups of about 6 people each. We're going to discuss what what Kai has put on the table. And then in 30 minutes, automatically, we're going to come back into this room and we're going to talk about our takeaways. Okay, so I'm starting the breakout rooms now. Saying skip, and I'll skip you guys. I'm also going to put some links in the chat. Okay, so we got Clint. Okay, all right. So I'm just going to go alphabetically. So first one is Anna. I'm going to unmute your. Okay, go ahead, Anna. Okay, Anna skips. Carla skips. Chachi. Chachi, what were your takeaways?
I think my takeaway is really the idea of reason, because I think it was Kai or maybe Chase that was talking about needing a reason to reject Darwin, a reason for faith. And then when we were in our small group, we were asking a lot of questions why about why, just a lot of why questions. So it made me think that sometimes maybe just the why question is the reason. We have to keep asking why, and maybe we don't have all the answers. Maybe just asking why is enough sometimes. And I think
Okay.
that's all. I think when we just look around, just ask why.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Dave. Dave, go ahead.
Thanks, Shrikant. Lee led us to a nice discussion about science always advances or other religions updated to take advantage of that. And I think we got into a very good discussion about Stoicism depending on ethics and right or wrong, where religion has brought it divisions and dislikes and disharmony. So it was a very good discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Next up is Deborah. Deborah, go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I liked the way that the presenter talked about inclusiveness, or it was kind of implied in his speech. And we talked about the fact that Stoicism can be thought of as an umbrella over any religious or non-religious belief system. So it's very, very inclusive. And so we felt like that was a really positive thing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah.
Next one up is Edward. Edward, go ahead. Edward, you need to unmute yourself. Okay. Next.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. We had a discussion about whether you can really conclude virtues or establish virtues from nature. And I don't know, my thoughts were that if you limit nature to physics, it's probably not possible. But if you expand it to our human nature, our evolution, the animal world, and the animal social behaviors, I think probably the primary idea that is in practically every religion for the last 5,000 years at least is the golden rule, right? The idea of reciprocity. So,
Thank you. Thank you. Next
Thank
up
you very much.
is Gang Tan. Sorry, Gang, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think yeah, we have very good discussion. We talk about different social problems and also the science, how the science changes. Different religions didn't really change as much. Actually, I think the only one I know is updating is Buddhism, you know, because I listened to them, they were really updated with science research. But anyway, and I really like the Stoicism because it's not religious and they can be more, you know, more people can accepting it, and it really gave people some kind of base for moral standards without, you know, make people, how do you say, have this burden. So it's more the internal thing. I really like it. I think it can have people, united people with different religion. I think different religion, it's basically like the same. If we study Carl Jung, you know, it's all different religion have the same symbols eventually, but they think they're different. So maybe through Stoicism, we can unite them.
Thank you, Gang.
I certainly hope so.
Next one up is James Wan. James, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we talked about Stoicism in relation to other philosophies of spirituality, like the Eastern religions, Indian notion of God, and Taoism, and how it can be relied on to understand how to live your life. In that sense, it's sort of like Confucianism, because it brings in, you know, Confucianism emphasizes how we should live, and it seems like Stoicism, you know, is that kind of philosophy. But the idea of a God or of a universal spirit is a kind of spiritualism. But we also talked about the materiality that, like Taoism, it's the Tao or God is in nature, in everything.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was unmuted. Well, I mean, there's a number of things that I've taken actually, and I am going to have to go back and listen to Kai's discussion again, because there was quite a bit shared. So it was, you know, a lot to take in. So thank you. The idea that I'll take away most from this discussion is the idea of knowledge and the ability that Stoicism is sometimes viewed as being inflexible, and that is just not true. There's a lot of flexibility, as you know, Kai had mentioned, and there's a willingness and natural curiosity for knowledge that works in accordance with nature. And that is not, you know, that is sometimes seen as, some people see that as mutually exclusive. And that is certainly not true in Stoicism. So, I mean, those are some of the major things. Is the other thing we discussed that was very interesting was the evolution of virtue and knowledge in general, and how that actually works together. But it's interesting how we can also look at the cardinal virtues as still being true today, and you know, that these are something that are there seems to be something inherently good and universal in them, and that's reassuring. And that's what I'll take away from today.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Next up is Mike. Mike, go ahead.
I'm not sure we came to a universal conclusion, although I think some of the people in the panel thought they did. I went in thinking that science, religion, and Stoicism have kind of an orthogonal approach to the same sorts of problems, and they don't match each other. They come to a different approach. I've heard the statement that science deals with how and religion deals with why. and they're orthogonal in that point of view. So I reserve judgment, and I learned a lot about all three things, and morality, and the science of morality, the stoicism of morality, and the religion of morality. I think they're running into it from a different basis. So,
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Misty. Misty, go ahead.
I don't have anything to share except to say thank you for arranging this, and thanks for all the interesting input from the participants.
Thank you, Misty.
Thank you,
Next
Misty.
up is Mohsin.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So I took away as I said with Kai in our breakout room as well, about the 6 skills to build before being dressed as a Stoic. That's something that was new to me as well. And the 6 being physics, if Kai is a bit confused over what I'm referring to. And I also discussed with him the conflicts of Stoicism turning into a cult and having its own issues, and becoming an us versus them dilemma. And he opened up in a very beautiful way. So this was an amazing.
Thank you, Mohsin. I didn't know that Dubai had got such amazing natural beauty. But go ahead, Peter. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have anything to say more than what other people have said. I'll let other people have more time to talk.
Sounds good.
Thank you,
Phil.
Peter.
Phil, go ahead. Okay, next one is Siri Kamen.
Hi there. First of all, I want to say thank you too. What a great opportunity to listen to some amazing discussion. One of the takeaways that we had in ours wasn't directly related to Stoicism, but the idea of history is a collection of stories. And that just really stuck with me. So those in my group know what I'm referring to, but it was a lot of fun. I also really enjoyed the conversation about the physical, the natural. All of it was really helpful. And I did walk away with more questions, like how does Stoicism connect with pantheism? So I've got more studying to do.
I have a paper on that, Siri. If you email, well, I can put my email address down below. I actually have a paper on that particular subject.
You do? I would love that. Okay, thank you.
I have a few things on that. So yeah, maybe I should put my academic email down here, so that if anybody has an academic question or even not an academic question, you can email me, because they're all open access as well. So I pay to have things in open access so you guys can access it.
Okay, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Next up is Dan. Dan, go ahead.
Yes, the best quote from our breakout session came from Jung. She said that Christians are taught to believe, but Stoics are taught to question.
Very nice. Next up is Terry. Terry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm kind of frightened of the spirit thing and think it's associated with pyramids and so on. So it was very reassuring to have the interpretation of God by Kai, which was a much more rational character. So my concerns about that being reduced.
Okay. Last is Joel. Joe from Canada.
Thanks,
Joe,
Shirkan.
go ahead.
I guess the biggest thing I got out of this is you have an amazing talent for drawing wonderful people from all over the world. It was amazing to me how diverse the group we had, and we have now a new challenge. Someone in the group, and I think I know who it was, but I won't identify him, suggested that what would really make it out of this world is if we could get a participant from the space station. And I would certainly look forward to being part of that group.
Okay, I will. I'm going to keep trying. I'm reaching out to people across the world, and I'm reaching out to at least 25 different cities, including Dubai and Delhi and Seoul and Paris and Sao Paulo and Montreal, and every city here. And I think what happens is that this dialogue is very important. And what we share is that everybody's trying to learn things, and everybody is serious about learning things on their own, but they're also open-minded in the sense that they're actually curious about saying, okay, where is the other person coming from? And that's the kind of culture that we built in our New York meetup. And I think it was very, I was very scared to see how would it scale up in this online world. But it looks like it is doing that. And we're getting amazing people like Kai and Massimo and Bill and Don coming and talking about it, as well as many people in different areas like Carl Jung specialists coming. And so it's been incredible. So so thank you very much, Joe. Appreciate the compliment.